school secretary called at 2:40 on a Wednesday afternoon, her voice carrying that particular careful neutrality people use when they're relaying something they've been told not to editorialize about. Could I come in Friday morning for a meeting with the counselor? My name is Madison Hayes. I'm 29. I work as a veterinary technician outside Austin, Texas, a job that has trained me over 6 years to notice the exact gap between what an animal's owner tells you and what the animal's own body is actually saying, the specific limp that doesn't match the injury described, the way a dog flinches from a hand that supposedly never hurt it. I never expected to need that instinct applied to my own daughter's school. Lily, my daughter, is 8, sharp and funny in a way that occasionally makes teacher conferences feel more like negotiations than updates. A kid who reads 2 grade levels ahead and still insists on sleeping with a nightlight shaped like a shark. I raised her mostly alone since she was 2, when her father and I split, an amicable enough separation that had settled, over the years, into a workable co-parenting arrangement, him seeing her every other week, me handling the day-to-day. My own father, Gary, lived about 40 minutes away and had taken Lily most other weekends since she was a toddler, a standing arrangement that had felt, until that Friday morning, like one of the more stable pieces of her childhood, one I genuinely never thought to question. Gary raised me alone too, after my mother left when I was 6, a specific, complicated history between us that had softened over the years into something functional, if never quite fully warm. He remarried 4 years earlier to a woman named Deborah, a marriage I genuinely tried to support even though something about the specific speed of it, and Deborah's own particular way of managing every room she entered, had always sat slightly wrong with me in a way I'd never fully named out loud, even to myself. The meeting room held 3 chairs arranged in a loose triangle, the counselor, a woman named Renee Castillo, sitting behind a low table with a folder already open in front of her. She didn't waste time on pleasantries once I sat down. "Madison, I need to ask you something directly," she said. "Have you recently relapsed?" I told her I'd never used drugs in my life, and I watched her face do the specific thing a professional's face does when they're trying to hold 2 contradictory pieces of information at once, without letting either one show too plainly. Renee turned her folder around so I could see it. An anonymous report, submitted through the district's online safety tip line roughly a week earlier, alleging that I'd driven my 8-year-old daughter while intoxicated, that I left prescription medication within her reach at home, and that I sometimes disappeared for days at a time, leaving her with unclear supervision. None of it was true. I told Renee that plainly, my voice considerably steadier than I actually felt, and she nodded, explaining that the district was required to look into any report regardless of its source, and that a second, more detailed report had come in 3 days later adding specific dates. "That's actually why I wanted to see you today," she said. "I need you to walk me through your custody and visitation schedule, because every single incident described in these reports happened on a weekend. And every one of those weekends, according to our own emergency contact records, Lily was staying with her grandfather." I sat with that for a long moment before I could answer her, running the calendar in my head, and understanding, with a specific, sinking clarity, that she was right, that I could already picture exactly which weekends those had been without needing to check anything. Renee's notes, once she walked me through them line by line, contained a detail that stopped me cold. A specific description of a prescription bottle left on the kitchen counter within a child's reach, down to the color of the label, a level of specificity that had no possible source in my own home, since I don't keep prescription medication anywhere Lily could reach even if I wanted to. A habit drilled into me by 6 years of handling controlled substances at the clinic. "Where would someone get that level of detail?" I asked Renee. "That's what I'm asking myself too," she said, her own voice carrying a specific caution that told me she'd already been turning this over before I ever walked into the room. I drove home that afternoon in a fog, picked Lily up from her after-school program, and sat through dinner and homework and bath time on autopilot, that specific description of the prescription bottle repeating itself in my head the whole time. Nothing about my own kitchen matched it. My kitchen counter held a fruit bowl and a coffee maker, and most days, a stack of unopened mail I kept meaning to sort through. Pharmacy records, once I requested them through my own insurance portal that same evening, told a story I hadn't expected. The medication described matched, almost exactly, a prescription filled under Deborah's own name at a pharmacy near Gary's house, a bottle that had never once been anywhere near my apartment. A specific match I confirmed by comparing the label description against my own insurance's pharmacy lookup tool late into that night. I called Gary directly the following evening, keeping my voice as level as I could manage, and asked him plainly whether he knew anything about reports being made to Lily's school. He denied it immediately, too quickly, in a tone I recognized from childhood as the specific register he used whenever he'd already decided what story he was going to tell before I'd finished asking the question. The same tone he'd used explaining, at 11 years old, why my mother wasn't coming back and it wasn't anything he'd done. I didn't push further that night. Some instinct told me I needed more than a phone call before I confronted him directly, that a phone call gave him too much room to simply talk his way around whatever I actually knew. A text message surfaced 2 days later, forwarded to me accidentally by Gary's own sister, my Aunt Carol, who'd meant to send it to someone else entirely and mistyped a contact. In it, Gary asked someone, apparently a friend who worked in a different school district, whether the school had started the safety process yet. A phrase that made my stomach drop reading it, understanding, for the first time with any real clarity, that this wasn't confusion or misplaced concern. Someone was actively managing this, checking on progress the way you'd check on any project you had a specific stake in completing. Carol, once I called her to ask about the message directly, admitted, reluctantly, that Gary had mentioned to her, weeks earlier, some vague concern about whether Lily would be better off with more stability. Language Carol had chalked up at the time to ordinary grandfatherly worry rather than anything more deliberate. "He said you seemed stretched thin," Carol told me. "I didn't think much of it. Parents get stretched thin. That's not the same as this." I drove to Gary's house the following weekend under the pretense of dropping off Lily's forgotten backpack. And while Gary was in another room getting Lily a snack, I noticed his home printer's output tray held a document I recognized instantly, even from across the room, by its header. A draft guardianship petition, Lily's name typed into the section for minor child, Gary's own name listed as proposed guardian, the document's date stamped from nearly 3 weeks before that first anonymous report ever reached the school. I photographed it with my phone before he came back into the room, hands shaking slightly, careful to keep my expression neutral when he walked back in. A message surfaced that same week, forwarded to me by a mutual friend who'd seen it posted in a private group Deborah belonged to, from Deborah's adult daughter, a woman I'd met exactly twice at family gatherings, both times at holiday dinners where she'd spent most of the evening on her phone. "Finally got the guest room set up for her," the message read, alongside a photo of a bedroom decorated in colors I recognized, with a specific, nauseating clarity as Lily's favorites, the exact shade of purple she'd picked for her own room 2 years earlier. I hired a family law attorney the following morning, a careful woman named Priya Anand who'd handled an unrelated matter for a friend of mine years earlier. Priya listened to the entire timeline without interrupting, taking notes steadily, then explained, plainly, that what I was describing sounded like a coordinated attempt to establish a narrative supporting some kind of custody or guardianship action, but that she couldn't tell me with certainty what legal consequences my father might eventually face, since that would depend heavily on how the school's own investigation and any subsequent child services review actually concluded. "The most important thing right now," Priya said, "is documentation and making sure you don't coach Lily about any of this. Whatever happens next needs to hold up because it's accurate, not because it's rehearsed." That specific instruction mattered more than I initially understood. Renee mentioned, during our second meeting roughly a week later, that a school security camera covering the pickup line had captured something during Lily's most recent Friday dismissal. Gary crouched beside her before she walked toward the building, talking to her for close to a minute, his hand on her shoulder, her small face turned up toward his, nodding along to whatever he was saying. The audio wasn't picked up, but Renee had asked Lily, gently, in an age-appropriate way, whether her grandfather ever asked her to remember specific things to tell people. Lily, according to Renee's careful notes, said that Grandpa sometimes told her to tell the truth about how tired Mommy gets, a phrase specific and adult enough that it clearly hadn't originated with an 8-year-old on her own. I read that note sitting in my car in the school parking lot after that meeting, and I cried harder than I had at any single point since this whole thing started. Not from anger exactly, but from something closer to grief. Understanding that my own daughter had been quietly, carefully positioned as a small, unknowing witness in something she was far too young to understand the shape of. I didn't confront Gary with any of this directly. Priya's advice was clear that whatever came next needed to happen through the actual, formal process, rather than another private conversation he could later dispute or reframe, that anything I said to him privately would simply become another thing for him to explain away. Child Protective Services opened a formal case roughly 10 days after that first school meeting. A caseworker named Denise Fontaine assigned to conduct the actual investigation, a process considerably slower and more methodical than I think either of us expected going in. Denise interviewed me first, a 2-hour conversation at my own apartment where she walked through Lily's daily routine, my work schedule, my own history, careful and thorough in a way that felt, even while genuinely stressful, appropriately serious. Denise interviewed Lily separately and carefully in a setting designed specifically for children, a small, brightly decorated room at the Family Services office with toys, and a specific, gentle interviewer trained for exactly this kind of conversation, a process I wasn't present for and had to trust entirely, sitting in a waiting room down the hall for 45 minutes that felt considerably longer. Denise eventually interviewed Gary as well, a conversation I obviously wasn't present for, though Priya later confirmed, through the formal case documentation we were eventually entitled to review, that Gary's own account had shifted noticeably between his first and second statements, small inconsistencies about dates and details that hadn't been present in his initial version. I want to be honest that those weeks were genuinely difficult, sitting with the knowledge that my own daughter's stability was being formally evaluated because of something my own father had apparently set in motion, while trying, simultaneously, to keep Lily's daily life as normal and unstressed as I could manage, packing her lunch, checking her homework. Reading the same 3 chapters of her current favorite book every night because she liked the specific comfort of repetition during a period she could clearly sense, even without understanding, was different. The formal meeting Denise arranged, roughly 6 weeks after that first school call, brought together myself, Gary, Renee, and Denise in a conference room at the district's Family Services office, fluorescent lighting, a box of tissues nobody had touched yet, the specific institutional quiet of a room built for exactly this kind of conversation. I laid out the timeline exactly as Priya had helped me organize it. The dates of each report matched against Lily's weekend schedule, the pharmacy records showing the medication belonged to Deborah, the printer document, the message from Deborah's daughter about the bedroom, each piece placed on the table in careful order, dated and labeled the way I'd label a chart at work. Denise asked Gary directly why he'd reported medication that had never been in my home. He said he'd been trying to protect his granddaughter, that he genuinely believed I was struggling more than I was letting anyone see, his voice carrying a specific, wounded defensiveness that made him sound, for a moment, almost convincing. I asked him whether protecting a child included teaching her what to say about her own mother. He didn't have an answer for that. He looked instead at the table between us, the same posture I remembered from childhood whenever he'd been caught in something and hadn't yet figured out how to talk his way clear of it. Denise then explained, carefully, what the school security footage combined with Lily's own statements had suggested, that this hadn't been a father struggling with a difficult worry, but a pattern of coaching a child to support a narrative someone had already decided to build. She was clear that Lily herself wasn't being treated as a witness against her grandfather in any formal sense, but that the visitation arrangement would be suspended, at minimum temporarily, while a fuller family assessment took place. I told the room, plainly, that I wasn't asking anyone to make Lily hate her grandfather. I asked only that any future contact happen through supervised visitation once a professional evaluation determined it was appropriate, and that no adult, ever again, question my daughter about her own home without me present. Gary's own attorney, present for that meeting, attempted, near the end, to suggest that this entire process could be resolved more simply if I'd simply agree to some informal continuation of the existing weekend visits under a general promise of better boundaries. An offer Priya declined on my behalf immediately, explaining that any future arrangement needed to go through the formal assessment process rather than a handshake agreement built on trust that had already been demonstrably broken. The investigation closed roughly 2 months later, finding no evidence whatsoever supporting the original drug or neglect allegations, and the school formally corrected its records to reflect that conclusion, a letter arriving in my mailbox that I read 3 times before I fully let myself believe it. Gary's unsupervised access to Lily was suspended pending the completion of a separate family assessment process, one Priya explained would take its own additional months to fully resolve. I chose not to pursue criminal charges immediately, a decision I made carefully, alongside Priya, weighing what that path would actually accomplish against what Lily herself needed most in the near term, understanding that a prolonged criminal process would likely extend the uncertainty in her life considerably longer than either of us wanted. I did file for a formal protective parenting order, removing Gary from any school pickup authorization or access to Lily's medical information, a boundary the court granted without much contest given the documented timeline. Deborah, notably, never once reached out to me directly through any of this, though I heard, secondhand through Carol, that she and Gary's marriage had gone through its own visible strain once the guardianship plan collapsed entirely. Whatever promises had been made to her own daughter about raising Lily evaporating along with the case itself. Lily has short, supervised visits with her grandfather now, arranged only on the days she herself expresses wanting them, sessions that happen at a family center with a counselor present rather than at anyone's private home. She's asked me, a few times, why things changed, and I've told her, as honestly as I can manage for an 8-year-old, that some grown-ups make choices that hurt people even when they think they're helping, and that it's not her job to fix that or explain it to anyone. I sat in another school meeting last month, this one entirely ordinary, a routine parent-teacher conference about Lily's reading progress, her teacher genuinely delighted describing a book report Lily had written about sharks, complete with hand-drawn diagrams. Near the end, the new counselor, filling in for Renee that day, asked, almost automatically, whether Lily's grandfather would be picking her up that afternoon. I told her no, just me. That's how it's listed on the form now, and that's how it's going to stay. Driving home that afternoon, Lily chattering in the back seat about her shark report, I found myself thinking about that first meeting with Renee. The specific, careful way she'd asked her one question about dates rather than simply accepting the reports at face value. A small act of professional diligence that had, in the end, unraveled an entire plan someone had spent weeks quietly assembling. My father spent weeks building a false narrative to convince Lily's school I was an unfit mother, certain that a coordinated story delivered through the right institutional channels would move faster than anyone could think to check the actual dates against it. What he never accounted for was a school counselor careful enough to ask one more question about timing, and a mother willing to follow that question all the way down to a pharmacy receipt and a printer tray that told the truth he'd never expected anyone to find. If you've ever had a family member try to build a false story about you through the exact institutions meant to protect your child, I hope you find your own version of that counselor's careful question. Tell me in the comments, would you have pursued criminal charges immediately or handled it the slower, more careful way I did?